City Limits. Brought to us by the People's Committee for Melbourne every Wednesday at 9 a.m.
City Limits is Melbourne's only hour devoted to our urban environment,
To transport and planning and housing issues,
to privatisations and our utility services.
to building and or maintaining a sense of community. 855 on the AM band, if we can hear it through the noise and find it through the smog.
City Limits.
Okay, back on City Limits, and now we have Kelly Whitworth and Mike Collins as well to talk about their report on housing, activism and local government, and in particular a case study on the Bendigo Street Occupation. So welcome to you both.
Thank you. Good morning.
Yeah, and I thought we'd kick off. There's so many things to talk about in this report, and I want to congratulate you both on it. I think it's a great report. But I thought, quite simply, why don't you, one or other of you, tell us the background to it, how you came to it, what it's about, and again, essentially what you want to get out of it or what you got out of it as you see it.
Well, for those that aren't aware, there was a big housing occupation action in 2016 called Bendigo Street, which ran for over 8 months in a number of inner Melbourne suburbs, predominantly Collingwood, but also Parkville, Clifton Hill. And, I was part of the Homeless Persons Union at the time, which was a grassroots, lived experience advocacy organisation. And we got wind that there was a number of empty houses just sitting idle on this street in Collingwood called Bendigo Street. And some homeless women that had been staying there had been, after a couple of days, they were squatting. They were kicked out by the government or whoever. And they were aware that, there was a number of empty houses on this street. They called it like a ghost street. So we decided to, do this action one morning. There was about 30 of us who rocked up in the dark. We started occupying one of these houses. We sent out press releases. We got on 3AW Talkback that morning. And all of a sudden this thing really kicked off, and the police came down, and Stephen Jolly, a Yarra councillor, came down, and a very opaque real estate agent.
Can I just interrupt here, because what you didn't mention, I think we should, I'm sure most people are aware, but they were vacant because they'd been acquired by the previous government because of the East-West link, which this government then didn't continue with, and so they were suddenly there as houses owned by the public.
Yeah, that's right. Prior to us going there, Yarra Council had been advocating for these houses to be made into maybe emergency accommodation for people that were homeless or public housing, but we weren't aware of that when we rocked up. And 6 months prior to our arrival, some of them were gifted to an organisation called Magpie Nest, which is a joint kind of group between Collingwood Football Club and Salvation Army of all parties, and they're set up to provide housing for people that have been homeless. They were gifted some of them, and 6 months later they were still empty. So that's one of the reasons why we went there, because we wanted to draw out what was going on, who was responsible, who owned these houses now, who was managing them, why the hell were they still empty when the homeless street count had just been conducted in the city of Melbourne, and there was 250 people just in the CBD sleeping rough. So, we went there one morning and we ended up staying there 8 months.
Amazing. And Mike, do you want to give a little bit of background as to your connection to the occupation?
Yeah, well, I worked and still do in local government, not in the local council, Yarra Council, but in a neighbouring council at the time, and had been very aware and involved, I guess, in supportive activities and behind the scenes kind of advocacy around Bendigo Street. My council was called Moreland Council at the time, had passed a unanimous motion supporting the Bendigo Street Occupation. So I was aware and kind of supportive and connecting with the Homeless Persons Union at the time. But then a little bit later, there was an opportunity that came up through the Melbourne Social Equity Institute, which is part of Melbourne University, And they're an outfit who do really, really interesting work, and they're really about doing research that's coming not from academia, but coming from the people, coming from the community. And they presented an idea that me, as somebody working in public policy, could join up with somebody working in the community to actually do some research on something that matters. And it just came to mind that, well, I think, and this is a couple of years later, I thought, well, Bendigo Street matters, and there's a risk that it gets forgotten. These things happen and people move on. And I knew Kelly and asked Kelly, hey, what if we actually do a piece of work? And what we wanted to do, because, you know, with research and with so much happened in Bendigo Street over 8 months and around it and so much from it, we needed to kind of, I guess, narrow down the scope of the research a bit. So what we looked at is the relationship between the activism that happened and the activists and local government, and tried to kind of understand the dynamics of that over the 8 months. So that's what the research is primarily about. But also I think we try to tell a story and give a little bit of a simple history of actually what happened over those 8 months, because it hasn't really been well documented since it happened.
Well done on that score. But what do you want to get out of it? I mean, where do you think, in terms of what we learned from Bendigo Street, where do we go from here in that sense?
I think because we had a kind of two-pronged approach. Firstly, we wanted activists to understand what they need to know to be better advocates when it comes to grassroots activism. What are the barriers to getting what you want? What are the communication kind of flows that you need to understand? And then on the other side, it was, what can local councils do when their policies are aligned or their values are aligned with the action that's actually occurring, which I think they were in this case. What can they do to better understand, to better support activists on the ground? So that's the two kind of parallel lines that we went down. And yeah, our discussion in the paper and our recommendations kind of feed into those two kind of prongs, and we can talk
interesting
about
that can happen, because I was the council spokesperson at Fitzroy during the freeway struggle in the 70s, and we actually funded workers to work with the community. We brought out a weekly or fortnightly maybe newspaper for the community. We even at one stage blocked the road on Alexandra Parade, so it's now the shortest state highway in the country because the government took it off us. That was a case where it was Collingwood and Fitzroy in those days. They're all part of Yarra now, but the councils really led the community in many ways on that struggle, and that can happen, and it should happen. You're right. Yeah.
And that's one of our recommendations. Is called Tell the Story and Counter the Agendas. And so what we're saying there is that, as you say, Kevin, local government do have an in-house media team, who disseminate information about what's going on in the municipality, and they alert citizens to issues that are occurring at a state or even national level. And so these communications teams could, inform grassroots actions. They could liaise with activists and draw on their information and networks to provide accurate reporting on events.
And during the dispute, of course, the state's role was incredibly negative, wasn't it? Like, it even said you're stopping people who need housing from getting housing when you've got homeless people and women fleeing violence, etc., all there anyway, and Indigenous people living in these places. But they said, well, no, we need it for people who need housing.
Well, they needed to create some narrative, because what we were saying was really strong, and they knew that. And so the Royal Commission into Family Violence had just been released. And so then they created this narrative to say, oh, well, actually now these rat bags are standing in the way of women and children fleeing family violence. And that just wasn't the case. We actually had people like that staying on Bendigo Street. And as I said, the houses was empty for 6 months prior to us getting there. That was plenty of time for the Magpie Nest to house, people that were really vulnerable. And they weren't doing that. They were, in some of the houses, they were housing their actual employees. That's one of the most disgraceful things that came out of it all.
I picked that up. One of the things I noted in the report, I underlined that the Salvation Army had its own workers in some of the houses.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. And just to go on with the state's response, so the conclusion was that they didn't end up turning those houses into public housing stock. Do you know what happened to them instead?
To the best of my knowledge from kind of researching, nearly all, if not all of them, were sold on the private market by the state government.
Can I ask, it seems strange to me that I don't fully understand why the state government wouldn't just turn them into public housing. It doesn't really make sense to me why that would be such a hard thing for them to do. I
think that's a fair enough question to ask.
Right.
Good
rhetorical question.
It's a good rhetorical question. I think we've seen a bit of progress in terms of state government action in relation to housing in recent years. I say a bit of progress. There's a risk that progress is really stalling in terms of that commitment. But what we do see across state government housing policy over time is a real disconnect between different parts of government, even within departments. So you can have different state entities they own land, they own property, whatever, and they're often told by the policy, by the Department of Treasury and Finance, you've got to actually maximize the cash return on all your assets. And that flies in the face of the huge ongoing kind of need we have for social housing in this state, and the opportunities on what is often very, very valuable existing assets to actually turn them into community assets for the people. So it's
plus they talk about they always talk about social and affordable housing, but never public housing anymore.
Yeah, it's the state government policy is a reset in terms of, it's moving away from, even though the Director of Housing still officially is a landlord for 66,000 properties, the state government policy is eventually these all move out of the control of the state, and that's so. No more public housing or social housing.
And of course, in the period, the Yarra Council passed a resolution, I think a 5-part resolution, which was quite supportive. But one of the 5 parts was that they arrange a meeting with the then Housing Minister Martin Foley, but he just simply refused to meet with people.
And that was, and he wasn't the only one. But one point we make, I know we're focusing on the state government here, but one point we make from our research was that even at a local government level, even though Yarra Council had been at a policy level kind of supportive and had been advocating for the use of the houses for public housing, once the occupation started, by and large, they kind of backed away. And this is something we really wanted to point out, that they exercised a whole lot of caution, and Martin Foley didn't want to meet the local member at the time. Richard Wynne didn't want to meet with activists, but also local councillors didn't take themselves from kind of Richmond Town Hall or whatever and wander up to Collingwood and come and visit either. And that's part of the point we want to make about both officers in councils and councillors, the importance of actually going down and meeting people where they are and understanding what's going on. It's really crucial.
You make the point also that local government should have a far greater role in housing. But I wonder how in many ways, because I know, in my experience as a councillor in Fitzroy, where during the period of great gentrification, we were trying to prevent that in some ways, but it was almost impossible to stop. How can local government play a much stronger role in housing?
It's true that the setting is that state government is has got the primary role in relation to housing and in relation to planning, even though local government officially, does the planning of things. It's the state government really puts a lot of control on it. The answer is that it must start from a position that local councils understand the needs of their community. It starts from actually the need of what's needed in the community, and then work from there. It has its own assets, but it has actually, I think, a lot of power, both as an advocate, as a facilitator, being able to foster community action and different kinds of housing models that can be developed. I think there's a lot that can happen on the ground. We've seen some success of that occasionally in local government in Australia, but we know from around the world that there's a lot more can happen, but it has to be really about councils saying, this is our community. If the fact that so many in our community are either unhoused or in unaffordable housing, and that future communities, people who want to live here are going to have to move elsewhere, we have to do something about it, put it front and center, and then work at all these levels.
Yeah.
Now, somehow we're already running out of time, which I can't quite believe, and I think we need to get you both back on for a full show because there's still so much to talk about. I suppose in the meantime, do you have any call out for what listeners can do? Is there a way that they can access your report online for free?
Absolutely. It's located on the Melbourne Social Equity Institute page, and it's called, Mike?
Housing, Activism and Local Government, the Bendigo Street Occupation, a case study. It should be pretty easy to find, and we hope people give it a read. It's only, it's an hour well spent, I think.
Can I just finish up?
Circulate it amongst your networks in public places where people might find it of benefit to read, at libraries or wherever else, community book reading joints, wherever.
It's worth noting you talk about a guidance the state government put out. We'll finish up on this, but they said, and it's a very good comment, they say the process of working collaboratively with and through groups of people affiliated by geographic proximity, special interest or similar situations to address issues affecting the well-being of those people is a powerful vehicle for bringing about positive change that a community is invested in. It often involves partnerships and coalitions that help mobilise resources and influence systems, change relationships among partners and serve as a catalyst for changing policies, programs and practices, which is a great comment, but it's a pity they didn't practice it themselves.
Yeah, we thought it was worth kind of reminding those that are interested that this is what the state government was saying was how we should be working.
Yeah, that's right. All right, well, look, it's a great report. People should read it, I agree. And congratulations to both of you for doing it. And let's hope something comes out of it and we can, in the long run, it can do something about housing people.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks, Kevin
Zeb.
and Zeb.
Right, yeah.
Thanks.
City limits.